Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back into a quieter, dimly lit corner of the past. So go ahead, put down your phone if you can, let the room go soft, pull the blanket a little closer, and as your breathing slows, let's wander into the peculiar world of medieval executioners, the men who did the dirty work that polite society desperately needed but also desperately wanted to pretend didn't exist. Executioners lived lives of strange contradiction. They were both essential and despised, paid and protected, but shunned and cursed. And tonight, we're going to follow them past the chopping block, beyond their years of wielding the axe, and into the murky question of what happened when the killing stopped. Because unlike knights who rode into retirement with stories of valor, or monks who shuffled into peaceful cloisters, executioners rarely got the credit of a heroic farewell. Instead, they left behind bloodstains and public shame, which didn't make for an easy retirement plan. So, let's start at the beginning of their predicament. In most of medieval Europe, the executioner's role wasn't glamorous. It wasn't usually inherited willingly, though in some unlucky families it absolutely was. Towns needed someone to handle public punishments, beheadings, hangings, burnings, the occasional boiling in oil if the mayor was in a bad mood, and someone had to swing the sword. But respectable citizens weren't exactly volunteering. So often the job fell to people who already lived at the edge of society. Criminals whose sentences were commuted if they agreed to take up the axe. Outsiders, people with few other options. And from the moment they accepted the role, they bore a permanent social stain. Executioners were technically servants of the law. They kept order, carried out sentences, and maintained justice. But no matter how law-abiding they were marked by the work. Townspeople whispered about them, refused to touch them, sometimes refused even to look them in the eye. And yet people were more than happy to line up at the scaffold on market day and watch them perform. Because nothing says family outing in medieval Europe quite like dragging your children to see a thief quartered. Now, while they were active, executioners could at least rely on a steady income. Town councils paid them a salary. Sometimes they had a house provided. They often received extra pay for each individual punishment carried out, like a grim freelance fee structure. And, in a peculiar twist, many executioners also served as unofficial medical practitioners. After all, they knew anatomy quite well, in the most brutal sense. And since few other doctors wanted to treat certain unsavory conditions, executioners often doubled as healers for skin diseases, venereal issues, or nasty wounds. It's not exactly the medical care you'd dream of, but in the Middle Ages, you took what you could get. So long as they kept working, executioners had some protection. They were tolerated, if not liked, but retirement was another matter entirely. Imagine this. After 20 or 30 years of service, you put down your axe and say, well, that's enough heads for me. What now? Do you join the local tavern's backgammon circle? Do you knit? Not exactly, because once an executioner, always an executioner. Society rarely forgot. Retired executioners often found themselves still marked, still excluded. They carried the social stain to their grave. Some towns provided pensions, but these were unreliable at best. Sometimes a new executioner was chosen from within the same family, which meant older executioners lingered on, half retired, half hovering, never fully free from the work. Their names were often passed down through generations, like a grim family business nobody wanted but couldn't quite escape. And here's the real kicker. Sometimes when there wasn't a new executioner available, retired ones were dragged back into service. Imagine being 65, enjoying your morning porridge when a knock comes to the door. Sorry, Heinrich, we need you to lop off another hand today. Not quite the peaceful golden years most people hope for. One of the most famous examples comes from Nuremberg, in what is now Germany. The city employed executioners for centuries, and their records survive. We know that these men, yes, almost always men, lived in houses on the edge of town. Their families often became executioner dynasties because their children inherited the social stigma. No respectable guild or profession would accept them, so the path of least resistance was to continue the bloody trade. And this meant that when one executioner retired, his son might pick up the sword, which allowed the elder to step back gradually, but also meant that he never really escaped the family's reputation. At best, he became the grumpy old man sitting in the corner while his son handled the chopping. But what about those who didn't have family successors? Their options were limited. In some cases, retired executioners tried to move to a new town, where perhaps their name was less known. But people were good at sniffing out scandal. Word traveled, and before long neighbors realized, oh, that's the man who used to cut off ears. Others leaned more heavily into the medical side of their work. They might practice as bone setters, herbalists, or unofficial surgeons. But even then, their clientele was often restricted to the desperate, other outcasts, the poor, or those suffering from conditions so embarrassing that they didn't care who treated them as long as it worked. A few rare cases show executioners trying to reinvent themselves as farmers or innkeepers, but these were exceptions. Most remained tethered, socially and financially, to their past profession. Let's drift now to one executioner named Franz Schmidt, arguably the most famous of them all. He worked in Nuremberg in the late 1600s and early 1700s, and he kept a meticulous diary of his executions. He performed more than 350 in his career, which is not exactly the kind of record you brag about at family dinners. What's striking is that Franz hated the stigma of his work. His father had been forced into the job, and he inherited it against his will. Yet he dreamed of respectability. Over decades, he carefully built up a reputation not just as an executioner, but as a healer. He treated hundreds of patients for various ailments, often for free. When he finally retired, he petitioned the emperor to grant him legal recognition as a medical man rather than as an executioner. And astonishingly, he succeeded. Franz Schmidt is one of the very few examples of an executioner who managed to scrub away the stain, at least officially. He died in relative peace, remembered not only for the lives he ended, but for the lives he saved. again? Still awake? That's all right. Tonight's next quiet detour takes us back to ancient Rome. Because it turns out sleeplessness is not a modern problem. Long before blue light, caffeine, or late-night doom-scrolling, the Romans were lying awake in their villas, staring at the ceiling, wondering why their brains refused to shut off. And just like us, they tried everything. Superstitions, strange diets, awkward home remedies, and a fair amount of wishful thinking. So let's drift into a Roman bedroom. Don't worry, it's not particularly romantic. The walls are plain, the bedding is scratchy, and someone's probably snoring on the other side of the house. But the problem remains the same. It's midnight, and you can't sleep. Now, first, let's talk about the Roman schedule. They didn't exactly live by a 9 to 5. The day was divided by daylight, with hours stretching or shrinking depending on the season, which meant sleep wasn't as rigid as we imagine today. People often went to bed earlier, woke in the middle of the night, then drifted back off, or got up to do something before returning to sleep. Historians call this segmented sleep, and it was fairly normal. But even within that flexible rhythm, insomnia was still frustrating. Imagine lying on your wooden bed frame, stuffed with straw, listening to the fountain in the courtyard. Drip, drip, drip. What to do? The most obvious Roman tactic was food. Naturally, Roman writers loved to prescribe diets for just about every problem, and insomnia was no exception. Some swore by light suppers, no heavy banquets, no late-night feasting. Others went the opposite route and recommended eating certain foods to knock yourself out. Poppy seeds, for instance, were known for their mildly sedative qualities. A spoonful of those mixed into honey could help soothe the restless. But warm milk? That's a medieval trick. The Romans would have found it laughably rustic. Instead, they leaned on herbs, especially things like lettuce. Yes, lettuce. Believe it or not, Roman writers insisted that lettuce made you sleepy. Not because it was light and fresh, but because it was thought to have cooling, drowsy properties. Which may explain why so many banquets ended with platters of lettuce. It was essentially their version of melatonin gummies. And then there was wine. Of course, there was wine. Wine was the universal Roman cure-all, from headaches to heartbreak. For insomnia, it was recommended to drink diluted wine, never the strong stuff, since that might backfire and keep you tossing and turning. A soft cup before bed was thought to calm the nerves and quiet the mind. Though, knowing Roman wine, which was sometimes mixed with things like seawater, resin, or lead, one wonders if the sleepiness was just mild poisoning. But food and drink weren't the only answers. Romans also turned to rituals and charms. Insomnia, like many ailments, was often blamed on the gods or on restless spirits. So one could recite prayers before bed. Special incantations were supposed to keep away bad dreams. And in some cases, people literally tied amulets around their necks or placed them under the pillow to ward off the night's disturbances. One favorite charm involved writing words backwards on a scrap of parchment, folding it up, and keeping it near the bed. Because nothing lulls you to sleep quite like the Latin equivalent of "ecce like this." Now, if prayer and lettuce weren't working, the next option was bathing. Romans were obsessed with their baths, morning, noon, and night. A warm soak was thought to relax the muscles, soften the skin, and quiet the mind. Imagine it, slipping into a steaming bath in a marble hall, oil lamps flickering, the faint scent of herbs in the air. Honestly, that sounds like the most reasonable solution of the lot. But, as with everything in Rome, there was a catch. Bathing was often a social affair. So while you might hope for tranquility, you might also find yourself stuck next to a chatty neighbor discussing grain prices while you're trying to unwind. Not exactly restful. Doctors, of course, had their own ideas. Ancient medical writers like Galen and Celsus offered long-winded advice on sleep hygiene. Things like sleep in a dark, well-ventilated room. Don't lie flat on your stomach. Rub your temples with oil. Avoid excessive excitement before bed. In other words, the same advice you might find in a modern wellness blog, just with more olive oil involved. One particularly odd prescription was to rub the soles of your feet with cabbage juice. Apparently, cabbage was believed to draw down heat from the head and settle it into the body. Which sounds like nonsense, but hey, people will try anything at 3 in the morning. Then there was music. Romans loved soft music in the evenings. Lyres, flutes, gentle singing. Wealthy households sometimes hired musicians to play in the background during dinner, and that soothing atmosphere carried into bedtime. A few writers even described lullabies for adults, slow, droning songs meant to ease the mind into quiet. If you've ever dozed off to the hum of white noise or a YouTube channel about medieval executioners, you'll understand the appeal. And finally, there were the philosophers, because nothing says good night like a dose of stoicism. Seneca, for example, wrote about lying awake at night, plagued by thoughts. His solution was not lettuce or wine, but philosophy. He suggested calming the mind with rational reflection. If worries kept you up, you should examine them, decide whether they were worth caring about, and then, ideally, let them go. Which is a noble idea, but let's be honest, it's a lot harder to rationally examine your anxieties at 2 a.m. than Seneca made it sound. Still, for those who embraced it, philosophy served as a kind of mental sleep aid. And finally, there was the most desperate remedy of all: drugs. The Romans knew about opium. They imported it from the East, and it was occasionally used in small doses as a sleep aid. Mixed with wine or honey, it could knock you out quite effectively. Of course, it was addictive, dangerous, and sometimes fatal. But in a world without melatonin gummies or Ambien, desperate times called for desperate measures. So, when you put it all together, how did the Romans deal with insomnia? With a patchwork of food, wine, baths, charms, philosophy, and, when all else failed, a pinch of opium. It's oddly familiar, really. Swap lettuce for chamomile tea, the bathhouse for a hot shower, the charms for a weighted blanket, and you've got a surprisingly modern picture of people just trying to get a little sleep. But the most human detail comes from the writers themselves. Time and again, Roman poets and philosophers complained about sleeplessness, about lying awake at night, listening to the creak of the rafters, the barking of dogs, the sounds of the city outside. The Emperor Augustus, it said, was a famously bad sleeper. He kept servants near him at night to read or tell stories until he drifted off. which, frankly, makes him one of history's earliest fans of bedtime podcasts. So, if you're awake tonight, listening to this, well, you're in good company. Augustus himself would sympathize. And with that thought, let's let the Romans keep tossing and turning. We'll slip quietly away from their sleepless beds, leaving them with their lettuce, their wine, and their cabbage juice foot rubs. And we'll drift onward toward the next strange corner of history. Hey again, still with me? Don't worry, we're not going anywhere fast. Tonight's third meander takes us into the soot and fog of the Victorian city. London, Manchester, Liverpool, or really almost any sprawling industrial hub where the streets were busy, the air was thick, and the poor were plentiful. Now, when we talk about Victorian widows, it's easy to imagine the grand black crinolines of wealthy women in mourning, endless veils, tearful letters written on black-edged stationery. And yes, those women existed. But most widows weren't wealthy. They were ordinary working-class women who suddenly lost their husbands, the main breadwinners, and now had to figure out how to survive. And survival meant work, often hard, low-paid, and unpleasant work. So let's take a slow walk through the dim alleys of Victorian employment, where widows stitched, scrubbed, and scraped their way through life. First, the obvious: domestic service. Even before widowhood, many working-class women already worked as servants in middle-class households. If they lost their husbands, some returned to this life: cooks, cleaners, laundresses, nursemaids. It was steady enough, though exhausting, and usually required living in, which meant widows with children often couldn't take these jobs unless they farmed their kids out to relatives or, worse, to workhouses. For those who managed, service at least provided food and a roof, but it came with strict rules, long hours, and very little dignity. Imagine scrubbing someone else's floors for 12 hours a day, only to crawl back to a narrow bed in the attic. Glamorous it was not. Next, let's drift into the world of laundry. Laundry was the classic, respectable job for widows. In fact, census records from London show astonishing numbers of women listing their occupation simply as laundress. It was work that could be done from home or from a tiny rented room and didn't require expensive tools. All you needed was a wash tub, a mangle, some soap, and endless energy. But laundry work was brutal. Constant soaking, wringing, boiling, ironing. Your hands raw, your back aching, your lungs filled with steam and soap fumes. Payment was meager, and you were paid by the piece, which meant long hours for very little money. And yet, for many widows, this was the only way to stay afloat. The endless piles of other people's shirts, sheets, and underthings became the background of their lives. If laundry wasn't enough, there was sewing. Victorian cities ran on cheap, mass-produced clothing, and much of it came from the hidden workforce of widows and poor women hunched over sewing machines in tiny, dimly lit rooms. Piecework, it was called. A penny for a dozen buttonholes, a few pence for a shirt. The work was monotonous, the pay appalling, and the deadlines relentless. Families could starve while the mother stitched 12 hours a day. Charles Dickens, in his usual gloomy way, loved to write about these women. The needlewomen, he called them, wasting away in poverty. And indeed, many did. If their eyes gave out, if their fingers stiffened, they were ruined. No work, no pay, no food. Some widows turned to street trades, selling flowers, selling matches, selling apples from a basket, anything that could be bought cheaply in bulk and sold at a tiny profit on the pavement. These women became familiar figures in the city streets: the flower girl, the orange seller, the woman calling hot pies on a cold evening. But street selling was precarious. The weather could ruin your day, police could move you along, customers could cheat you. And if your goods didn't sell, you went hungry. Still, it offered independence of a sort. A widow with a strong voice and a bit of grit might scrape out a living, hawking goods among the endless crowds. Of course, not every option was respectable. Some widows had little choice but to drift into survival sex work. The Victorian city had no shortage of brothels, and poverty was a cruel recruiter. Women too old or too weary for formal prostitution might work in the gray area of casual sex work, taking a man for a night or an afternoon when money ran short. For some, this became a grim pattern. For others, it was an emergency stopgap. Society condemned them naturally, while also keeping them in business. The hypocrisy of the era was staggering. Respectable gentlemen who thundered about morality by day could be found slinking into cheap rooms by night. Widows bore the brunt of that contradiction. Another option was taking in lodgers. If a widow had even the tiniest house or room of her own, she could rent space to single men or travelers. It was risky, especially if the lodger was unpleasant, violent, or unwilling to pay, but it offered steady cash. Victorian newspapers are full of tiny advertisements placed by widows offering a clean bed, modest company, and breakfast. Of course, sometimes modest company was code for something else, but for many, it truly was just the business of renting a corner of the house. In industrial cities, some widows found work in factories. Textiles, match factories, pottery, tobacco processing. Dangerous, noisy, and underpaid, but at least predictable. A widow might stand at a loom for 12 hours or dip matches into phosphorus until her jaw began to rot. Yes, phossy jaw was a real occupational hazard. Factories also took in children, which meant widows could sometimes keep their families together by sending children to work alongside them. A grim solution, but one that kept everyone out of the workhouse a little longer. Speaking of the workhouse, this was the final stop for widows who couldn't make it on their own. The dreaded poor law system made sure that charity came with punishment. Workhouses were designed to be unpleasant, to discourage people from relying on them. Families were separated, food was meager, and labor was exhausting. Widows dreaded ending up there, and so they scrubbed, stitched, and sold in the streets to avoid it. Some succeeded, many did not. There's something quietly tragic about the invisibility of these women. Census records list them in thousands: laundress, seamstress, charwoman, hawker, but their names blurred together. They lived in the margins, barely noticed, unless they caused a scandal. But they kept Victorian cities running. Every clean shirt, every steaming pie, Every tidy parlor bore the fingerprints of widows working to survive. They were the unacknowledged backbone of urban life. So, when we ask, what jobs did widowed women take in Victorian cities? The answer is simple but heavy. They took whatever jobs they could: scrubbing, stitching, selling, sometimes selling themselves. They worked until their hands bled, their backs bent, their lungs failed. And if they were lucky, their children carried on. If not, the workhouse swallowed them whole. Not the cheeriest bedtime story, perhaps, but there's a kind of calm in acknowledging their persistence. These women endured, quietly, stubbornly, in the face of impossible odds. So, as you close your eyes tonight, think of them. The laundress leaning over her tub, the seamstress squinting in the candlelight, the flower seller standing on a foggy street corner. Their lives were hard, yes, but they carried on. And with that, let's drift gently toward the next shadowed corner of history. Hey again. You're still here, drifting with me through the odd corners of history. Tonight's next stop takes us into the dust and roar of the Roman amphitheater. Because while gladiators themselves get plenty of attention, those doomed fighters sweating under the Mediterranean sun, their families rarely make it into the spotlight. Which raises the question, what about the children of gladiators? Did they grow up to fight in the arena as well? Were they free? Were they enslaved? Or were they just quietly forgotten by history? Let's take a slow walk through the fragments of evidence we have. First, a quick reminder about gladiators themselves. They weren't usually volunteers. Most were slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals. A few, the so-called auctorati, did sign up willingly, often for the money or the thrill. But in general, becoming a gladiator was not a career path anyone dreamed of as a child. This already shaped the fate of their children. If a gladiator was a slave, his children were slaves too. Roman law was painfully clear. The child inherited the legal status of the mother, which meant if your mother was enslaved, so were you, no matter how heroic your father looked in the arena. So right away, most gladiators' children started life at the bottom of the ladder, born into bondage, often inside the ludus, the gladiator training school. Life in the ludus was not exactly a nurturing environment. Children who grew up there were surrounded by violence, strict discipline, and the constant threat of death. Imagine your earliest memories being the sound of clashing swords, the groans of men in training, and the cheers from a nearby amphitheater. Some children stayed in the school, raised by mothers who were themselves enslaved camp followers, cooks or servants. Others were sold off because gladiators' children were considered valuable property. A boy might be raised as a slave in another household. A girl might be sent into domestic service. Their lives depended less on their father's fame and more on the whims of the lanista, the owner of the gladiators. But what if the father was successful? What if he was a champion, cheered by crowds, showered with gifts, even granted freedom? Well, that did improve things, sometimes. A gladiator who earned his rudis, the wooden sword symbolizing freedom, could marry legally, own property, and raise his children as freeborn Romans. Some of them did just that. We have inscriptions mentioning ex-gladiators as proud fathers, carving their family names into stone. But the stigma never really disappeared. Gladiators were adored in the arena, but despised outside it. Respectable Roman society looked down on them as brutish, tainted, socially unclean. And that stain lingered on their children. A freeborn son of a gladiator might never be entirely accepted among peers. So even when the family clawed its way into freedom, the shadow of the arena followed them. There's also the question of inheritance. Roman law technically allowed freed gladiators to pass on property to their children. But if the father died before winning freedom, any wealth he had could vanish back into the coffers of the lanista, which meant widows and children of still enslaved gladiators were often left with nothing. This may explain why many gladiators formed close bonds with one another, almost like extended families. The children of fighters often grew up together, raised in that strange subculture on the margins of Roman life. And yes, some boys did follow in their father's footsteps, not always by choice. Gladiator schools needed a constant supply of recruits, and what better source than the children already on hand? Sons of gladiators, especially enslaved ones, were often trained to fight. They grew up surrounded by weapons, discipline, and spectacle. And sooner or later, some found themselves in the sand. It's not unlike the grim family trades of later centuries, where a butcher's son became a butcher, or an executioner's son became an executioner, except in this case, the trade ended with lions. But it wasn't always doomed. Some children of gladiators found surprising routes out. We know of a few who became gladiator trainers themselves, safer, more stable work than fighting. Others joined auxiliary roles in the games, musicians, attendants, guards, still dangerous, but not directly life-threatening. And in rare cases, gladiators' children managed to slip into ordinary Roman society, especially if their parents gained freedom. They might marry, take up trades, blend into the urban poor. Their names would carry little trace of their father's brutal career. The daughters of gladiators faced different fates. Some grew up to become domestic slaves or street sellers. Others, uncomfortably often, were pushed into prostitution, especially in the lurid subculture that surrounded the games. Gladiator camps were magnets for sex work, and daughters could easily get caught in that web. And then there's the matter of female gladiators, gladiatresses. Rare, but real. A handful of inscriptions and accounts mention women fighting in the arena. Were any of them daughters of gladiators? It's possible. The lines between spectacle, slavery, and desperation blurred constantly in the Roman world. So, to return to the quiet question, what happened to the children of gladiators? The short answer is, nothing glamorous. They were born into stigma, often into slavery. Many followed their parents into violence or servitude. A lucky few slipped into freedom and obscurity. Their names don't remember. The Roman crowds cheered their fathers, but the children were just background figures, swept along in the machinery of empire. But there is something oddly comforting in this obscurity, because while gladiators were doomed to die in spectacle, their children often disappeared into ordinary life. They escaped the spotlight. They endured, anonymously, in streets and workshops and farms across the empire. Not heroes, not villains, just people, carrying the burden of a father's fame or infamy and making the best of it. So, as we settle deeper into the night, picture them, small children in the shadow of the amphitheater, playing with scraps of wood shaped like swords, watching the crowds roar, knowing their fathers might not come home. And then picture them grown, carrying baskets of laundry or sitting at looms, or marching in armor of their own. A generation shaped by spectacle, but mostly forgotten. Because in the end, history loves its gladiators, but it rarely spares a thought for their children. And with that thought, let's drift onward. Our next step might just take us back into the strange world of royal bloodlines, the marriages, the illnesses, the inbreeding, where fate was determined not by the arena, but by the throne.